Sweet, I think that's up and going. All right, we're going to go ahead and rock and roll through activity 1, consumption and absorption. So, number 1, what are the 4 general steps of processing food?
I can do this one.
Okay.
Ingestion, which is actually taking in food, and there are 4 different kinds of that. Digestion, which is the processing. Absorption is where the body uses the nutrients, and then elimination is getting rid of waste.
Nice. Yeah, it's important to note that distinction between ingestion, which is literally just like taking in the food, and digestion when you start breaking it down. Nice. Number 2, how are each of the types of ingestion and digestion different from each other? Who would like to do 2?
I can.
Okay, thanks, Haley.
So for the 4 types of ingestion, you have filter feeding animals, which are mostly aquatic animals since they filter out the water with the food particles. And then substrate feeding, which means that they stay on their food source and then leave behind a trail of where they were. And there's also the fluid feeders, like mosquitoes or anything that takes liquid out of another of its host in order to gain nutrients. And then there's bulk feeders, which are basically us and just take large bites out of everything. And then there's intercellular and extracellular. Intercellular is more based on phagocytosis and then transforming those into lysosomes to take up the nutrients. And then extracellular is where it's breakdown by different compartments.
Nice. Really well said, Haley. Thank you. So, yeah, those 4 things are pretty clear as done by Dr. Fernandez's examples in the PowerPoint. But there's a couple things that might seem tricky. If humans also consume fluids like water, doesn't that make us fluid feeders too?
But we don't solely rely on fluid in order to live.
Exactly. We're not getting like all of our energy just from fluid to live. We also have to eat large chunks of things, like bulk feeding. And then this is for everyone, but what's a good example of a substrate feeder?
Caterpillar.
Caterpillars, right? Think they eat the thing that they live on, and then once they're nice and chunky, they do the whole metamorphosis thing, and then they turn into a butterfly. But they're eating the thing that they live on. Nice. Okay, let's go on to number 3. What are some of the accessory glands for digestion?
I can do it.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Sydney.
So there's salivary glands, gastric glands, and then there's the gallbladder, pancreas, and the liver.
Nice. And what is an accessory gland?
I guess it's anything that assists in digestion.
Yeah, it's something that's aiding in digestion. I like to think of them as things that are not like the tube itself that food is passing through, whether that happens to be the mouth, the pharynx, the small intestine, the large intestine. They're organs outside of that alimentary canal, which is just like the fancy way of saying the GI tract. It's something that's like outside of the GI tract, dumping enzymes or other substances into the tract that are helping the digestion occur. So they're accessory because they're just helping. Number 4, describe in detail all that occurs digestively in the stomach. Ooh, boy.
I can do that.
Okay. Thanks, Will.
So how it begins is that food goes through, there's 2, so the way the structure of the stomach, there's a stomach, and then there's 2 sphincters on the top and the bottom, basically. So once the sphincter lets food from the esophagus into the stomach, basically, so the stomach produces gastric juice, which is a combination of pepsin and hydrochloric acid.
Mm-hmm.
And because that gastric juice basically mixes with the food through a churning action, which is just through contractions of the stomach, and that combination of food and gastric juice produces chyme. And so how this works, how this gastric juice forms is that so there's 2 types of cells on gastric glands in the stomach. There's parietal cells and chief cells. So parietal cells secrete hydrogen ions, and then in these little whatchamacallem, little little pores, chloride ions go through them, and then those bond together to form hydrochloric acid, which then and so then chief cells produce pepsinogen. Is that how you say it?
Pepsinogen, yeah.
Pepsinogen. So the chief cells produce pepsinogen, and then the hydrogen and the chloride bind together form hydrochloric acid, and that turns the pepsinogen into pepsin. And then once you have pepsin, that turns more pepsinogen into more pepsin. So yeah, and so those two molecules, the hydrochloric acid and pepsin are like both used to break down food in the stomach.
Nice. And thank you, Will. That was awesome. And this is for everyone. What kind of molecules does pepsin cut?
Peptide bond? No.
Peptide bonds, exactly. So therefore, it's what kind of an enzyme? If it's cutting proteins, it's a
Protease.
protease. Yeah. Remember, ace, that ending just means it's an enzyme. Proteo, it's probably going to have something to do with protein. And then kind of also, there's a couple other naming things going on here. When you look at the word pepsinogen, notice how it ends in the OGEN. Do any of y'all know what that means for an enzyme? It means it's currently in its inactive form. So they'll call those zymogens. You don't necessarily have to know this for the exam, but it's just kind of nice background information, and it'll show up in biochem and other classes. But most enzymes have an inactive form called the zymogen, where it's basically the enzyme's name, but with an OGEN on it. And the molecule is usually really similar, but there's a little thing hanging in the active site that's blocking its action. And so like in this case, it just takes a little hydrochloric acid, which I guess is actually a pretty strong thing, but a little hydrochloric acid, and that opens it up so that it can start cleaving the proteins. And then once it's that active form, then it's just pepsin and no longer pepsinogen. Does that make sense? So the ogen just like a precursor. It's the not quite yet active form. Trying to think of other things. Yeah, and then this overall process is an example of enzymatic hydrolysis. And that's kind of just like a general term. Enzymatic, we're talking about enzymes. Hydrolysis, water cutting or water to do a cut. Enzymatic hydrolysis is just any sort of process where you're using water to cleave something. Or an enzyme is using water to cleave. So this is going way back actually to last semester. If y'all remember dehydration synthesis and condensation reactions, where in the condensation reactions, you would use a water molecule and you'd stick an OH on one side and hydrogen on the other, and it would split something into two. Mm-hmm. That's basically what's going on with hydrolysis. You're using water, hydro, to lyse, to cleave apart or one thing into two things. And so pepsin as a protease fits into that category. And then because it's a protease, it can cut other pepsinogens into pepsin. So what questions do y'all have on stomach digestion? Nothing? Okay, yeah, and to make sure to know parietal cells, what they secrete. What do parietal cells secrete?
Hydrochloric acid.
Yes, the protons, the H+, and the Cl-, the chloride ions. And then what do the chief cells secrete?
Pepsinogen.
Pepsinogen. And make sure you know it's pepsinogen and not pepsin. It's really important that you secrete it in the inactive form. Otherwise, if all of your digestive enzymes were always active, they would digest the very cells they're sitting in, and you would digest yourself from the inside out, and that would not be good. Okay. All right, we'll move on to number 5. What happens in the duodenum, or duodenum, as some people say? What glands are secreting substances, and what are those substances? Who would like to take a shot at 5? Oh, Cole, thank you for volunteering.
Ooh, I didn't have anything written down for this, so.
Okay, then go ahead and pick a friend to help you out.
Yeah. Who has written 5? Just like raise your hand. Excited. Okay, Jenna.
So the duodenum is where chyme from the stomach mixes with digestive juices from accessory glands. And these glands are the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, and it's mostly the liver and gallbladder with bile.
Yeah, and then the small intestine itself is also going to secrete some enzymes. I think we were talking about this in one of the small groups. You start in the mouth with digestion of carbs with like all the amylases, and then you move the bolus of food. That's what you call it when it's like a little ball. And the bolus of food moves into the stomach and mixes with all the proteases. So that's where protein digestion starts. And then you get that kind of sloshy stuff. You call that chyme. So you start with a bolus and it ends up in chyme. And then once it gets to the small intestine, everyone else just piles in their digestive enzymes and aids. And then in that duodenum, the first 25 centimeters of the small intestine, you have a bunch of digestion occurring. And then after that, there's still some residual digestion, but it's a lot more absorption from there on. And especially by the time you get to the colon or the large intestine, it's basically just all water absorption at that point, and pretty much all digestion, if not all, has ceased. The pancreas is a weird one too. We haven't talked as much this semester about endocrine versus exocrine glands, but that's probably coming up soon. Just a little bit of a precursor. Where do y'all think endocrine glands secrete stuff? Inside the body or outside the body? Inside the body, right? And almost always this is into the bloodstream. Where do you think exocrine glands secrete secretions? Outside the body, yeah. So the pancreas is a weird one though, because technically, because your GI tract is continuous with like the air outside of either end of your GI tract, it's considered the outside of your body too. So any gland that's dumping things into your GI tract is technically an exocrine gland because it's dumping it outside your body. Even though you'd have to like cut through your belly to get inside your stomach, it's considered part of like the outside. So the pancreas would be an exocrine gland when it's dumping in those digestive enzymes. But the pancreas also adds insulin to the bloodstream and glucagon, which makes it an endocrine gland also. So some of these glands function both endocrine, dumping stuff into the blood, and as an exocrine gland, dumping things into the GI tract or outside the body. So some of them are just kind of weird and special like that. Just some things to keep in mind, I think, in chapter 2 when we get into all the organ systems. And the last thing that gets dumped in here, bile salts. What do bile salts do?
They break down the bonds in the triglycerides, don't they? And then they break it down, then go through the intestine, and then they kind of reform, and then go to the lymph system where they can be like absorbed, I think.
Exactly, yeah. Fats are really weird, and because most of the enzymes and most of the systems in the body are more water-like environments, the fats tend to basically just make globules. They all kind of clump together, and it's hard for enzymes to digest it. Imagine if you had, I guess, a bunch of ice cream you wanted to melt, and you had like a little Bic lighter to melt it. If you had all of your ice cream in a ball, it'd be really hard to melt it because you would light it and only a tiny bit of the outside would start melting. So instead, you would probably want to smash the ice cream out super thin and then hold the lighter over it, and it would like immediately start melting one bit at a time. That's kind of the general idea behind bile salts. It takes this huge chunk of fat and it's not digesting it. The bile does not break the fatty acids themselves down, but it breaks them into tiny little balls, and then your body can more appropriately adjust and respond to those. Whereas when there's just those huge globules of fat, it can't really do anything with them because they're too large for the lipases to be effective. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Thanks, Haley. Number 6. Oh, darn it. Well, what occurs in the small intestine? What special features or adaptations does it have? We kind of talked about this a little bit, but who would like to explain 6? Thank you, Maddie.
Like we said, a lot of the enzymatic hydrolysis occurs there. And it also has a huge microvillar surface. And that's all I got so far for number 6.
Nice. And what are the villi and the microvilli, and how are they helpful? This is for anyone. How do the villi or the microvilli help with the digestive process?
I think this is just a guess. Don't they like absorb nutrients? Is that?
Exactly, yeah. And they're adding more surface area for absorption to occur in. This gets back to the surface area to volume from either last session or 2 sessions ago. If you just had a straight, like, thin tube that was your small intestine, you wouldn't have that much area to absorb stuff. So instead, you have all these wrinkles in your small intestine, and then on those wrinkles, like if this is one fold, there's extra little tubes that stick out from that. This initial wrinkle is a villi, and then the little things sticking out are microvilli. And so it adds this massive amount of surface area that allows for more absorption. Because up until like the last 100 or 200 years, people have always struggled to get nutrition or get enough nutrients. So you want to get as many calories, as much energy as possible. And so your body's adapted to do that. Now it's a bit different where people are having health issues from things of absorbing too much energy, I guess you could say, or being overweight. So now there's kind of a different thing that, who knows what kind of evolutionary impacts that'll have. But historically speaking, people have struggled to get enough energy. And so those are just some of the adaptations to help you absorb as much energy as possible from the things that you eat. Neat. Okay, jumping on to 7. Why does blood from the GI tract travel to the liver before the heart?
Isn't it just like a filter mechanism?
Exactly, yeah. It's just that the liver does a lot of things, but one of the main things it does is detoxify stuff. And so that's why when you hear about alcoholics having sclerosis of the liver, sclerosis is just some sort of scarring. And so they're having liver damage because they're drinking so much alcohol, and the liver is basically getting damaged from trying to process all of it. And it's just too much for the liver to handle. Do any of y'all know what the special kind of vein is that takes blood from the GI tract to the liver?
Hepatic portal vein.
Portal vein.
Nice. And do any of y'all know like what that means?
The what vein?
Hepatic, it doesn't that mean liver?
Nice. And what makes it a portal vein?
A bunch of other veins come together, so it's like kind of they meet in one spot, then they all go to the liver. Liver sends it through another vein to the heart.
Yes, it's when you're having blood that's already in a vein go through another vein to get to another vein. Sorry, that's maybe not the best explanation, but you're having blood get absorbed in the GI tract, and then it's going through a special vein to the liver first, and then getting put through that, and then it gets put back into regular circulation and goes to your heart. There's a couple other things that you definitely don't have to worry about now, but you might talk about in HPhys. Like a fetal heart has a couple different portal veins going through it to prevent blood from getting to the lungs, because that would actually damage the fetus before birth. And so it has these kind of shunts to avoid or to send blood in certain ways. But that's more fun for a later class. Okay, number 8, how are fats absorbed? Haley, would you like to take this one? You kind of already explained it earlier.
Sure. So it gets broken down by a specific pancreatic enzyme, and then that breaks down to glycerol fatty acids, or like a smaller chunk, and then that goes into passes the blood vessels and goes to the lymph system, and then it goes to your lymph nodes where it can be distributed. Exactly,
yeah. So you're having the bile salts break the fat globules into little smaller things called fat drops, which your body can absorb. And then you have lipase. Remember how we talked about proteases? That's a protein breaking down enzyme. Lipases are just enzymes that are breaking down lipids. That's where you get like the LIP and lipase. So that breaks down the globules into fatty acids and monoglycerides, and then they all eventually get pushed. They also form these things called chylomicrons. Because fat doesn't travel really well in the body, you have to package it in a special way. So you put proteins around all of the lipids, and those proteins interact really well with water. And so that way, even though you have a chunk of hydrophobic fats, by putting these proteins on the outside that are hydrophilic, it is now able to be carried later on in blood and actually move around your body. Otherwise, they would cluster really quickly, and that would just be awful. Yeah, I think that's about all for that. Sweet. Okay, number 9. What is the function of the colon, and what are some of its parts? Jordan, what do you have for this one?
Doesn't the colon function in like absorption mainly?
Mm-hmm. And what is it mostly absorbing?
Isn't it like water-based nutrients? Almost?
Yeah, exactly. It's after the chyme has gone through the small intestine and done most of the digesting and absorption of other nutrients, and then it gets to the large intestine or the colon, whatever you want to call it, and it just absorbs most of the water that's left. There's also the cecum, which is kind of this weird pouch, right, where the small intestine comes into the large intestine. Cecum's kind of like the pouch that's at the bottom, and then you have like the ascending, transverse, descending, rectum where the feces are stored, the anus where everything gets pushed out. There's a couple different little parts in there, but that's for like an anatomy class. I don't think she cares if y'all know that stuff. And then I'm guessing most of y'all know what the appendix is, a little string thingy that basically sits on the outside and just gets swollen and causes you to go to the ER. They have different theories as to it having like evolutionary functions for protecting your immune or storing good bacteria to help your immune system. But it's still no one exactly knows yet. So, okay, that's all of activity 1. What questions do y'all have for that? No questions on the questions?
So the appendix is like a small cecum, or?
The cecum is, so you have like the small intestine go into the large intestine. The cecum is kind of like the bottom of the large intestine that's sitting there. And then the appendix is sticking off of the cecum, I believe.
Okay.
And it just looks like a little, kind of like a loose pinky, just little white tube.
Yeah.
That doesn't do a whole lot other than cause issues. So.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and split back into groups. We'll go over activity 2 and then try and come back at 7:30, 7:35. Sound good?
Mhm.
Okay. Let's see. All right. I will see y'all back in about 15. Okay, sweet. All right, let's rock and roll through activity 2, adaptations and homeostasis. Start with number 10. What can we learn from a fossil's teeth? Who would like to take 10? Sure, thanks, Haley.
So with the teeth, you can tell like what kind of diet they've had, because like you can tell whether they're carnivore, omnivore, or if they're a herbivore. Because like with herbivores, they have more molars and premolars meant for grinding, and I think they're the incisors that are meant for like tearing off the grass, versus like canine who would have more, well, canines for like tearing and ripping things up, and not very many molars for chewing it up as much. And then humans are a bit of a combination of both.
Yeah, exactly. Just as you'd think, depending on what kind of teeth the fossil has, you can tell the kind of things that it eats. And if you'll notice in the PowerPoint picture too, the canines still have, carnivores still have some molars and premolars, but even though they are those, they look adapted different. And same with herbivores. They still have incisors in canines, but they look significantly different in herbivores versus carnivores. Like herbivores, incisors are more for like nipping off like a branch or something like that so that they can then chew on the leaves. Whereas for a wolf, its incisors are pretty sharp and more to bite in and rip off flesh. So they still have both types of, or multiple types of teeth between molars, premolars, canines, and incisors, just they look different depending on the organism. All right, number 11, how do the digestive tracts of carnivores and herbivores differ, and why do they?
I can go.
Cool.
So carnivores have a smaller digestive tract because it's more efficient for the digestion of meat. It doesn't really take as long as like plants would. So that's why herbivores have a longer digestive tract, because the digestion process for like plants is like a longer process and it's more complex.
Exactly, yeah. And what are some of the parts of herbivores that are longer in order to facilitate that?
Is it the cecum? Is that how you say it?
Cecum, yeah. They have a really big cecum.
And the large intestine.
Yeah, exactly. There's more chambers where the fermenting and that long-term digestion can occur. One other thing with carnivores too, you can kind of imagine if they're eating a bunch of raw flesh, that it could very well have bacteria or other things that would not be good for your health. So another reason for carnivores to eat things quickly is not only because meat takes less time to digest, but also to get that out of your body as quickly as possible, such that those bacteria or other things are not going to harm you or whatever carnivore is eating that meat. It's something we have to think about less since we can actually cook our food. But if you're some random coyote walking around, you don't want to catch something from whatever squirrel you just decided to eat. All right, number 12, how do bacteria of the gut affect the person that they inhabit? Yeah, Jenna, what do you have for this one?
So this is mostly talking about the microbiome, which is talking about microorganisms living in or on the body. And these microorganisms like bacteria can help break down food and also like protect, because there's like good bacteria and bad bacteria. So they might play a part in like the protection against bad bacteria.
Exactly, yeah. And there's also certain things where they can break down stuff in such a way that allows us to absorb them. And there's some really interesting new research. This is like stuff y'all don't exactly have to know, but it's just cool that they're doing genetic tests on the bacteria that they find in people's gut. And depending on what kind of groups of bacteria that you might be more predisposed to obesity or other things like that. And actually they have different things where they'll actually do a fecal transplant, where they'll take feces from one person and transplant it to another person's GI tract. And that way it gets back basically better bacteria or good bacteria from one person's body into the other one. I'm not sure why that's how they decided to do that, but I trust that the people who figured it out have good reasoning. It sounds like a bit of a crappy way to get new bacteria, but if that's what works, that's what works. So, all right. Enough of my poor puns. Moving on to 13. What are some adaptations in herbivores?
I got it.
Okay, cool.
So herbivores, they have certain bacteria that are made just for like digesting plants. So the bacteria in them convert the plants into carbohydrate sugars. They have the larger cecum, intestines, everything we just went through. And ruminants, they have a more elaborate system where they have multiple stomachs. And so the food goes down into the rumen, which is the first stomach, and then goes back up into the esophagus where it's rechewed, and then goes into the second stomach, which is called the omasum, where water is removed. And then it goes into the next one, which is the obasum, which has the obamsum, whatever, which has enzymes that digest the food. So the ruminants can get like nutrients from the grass and the microorganisms.
Yeah, thank you, Cole. Exactly. So this is, think of like cows. They're the classic ruminants. Love cows. But yeah, in order to get enough energy out of their grass, they just have to have 4 different chambers for digestion. And they get to chew their food twice because it just tastes so good that second time around. I imagine they have some adaptations too to avoid getting chemical burns in their mouth from all the stomach acid and stuff. But so those are things I don't know, and hopefully things y'all don't need to know for the test. But cool to think about all all the weird animal adaptations there are. Okay, neat. Thanks, Cole. Number 14, how does the endocrine system regulate digestion? And this one particularly, we'll keep this to the stomach, the things involved with the stomach, and then 16 can be all the exciting things with sugar and glucagon and all that. So who would like to explain 14? Yeah, thanks, Haley.
Okay, so with the endocrine system specifically, it will release hormones to either stimulate digestion or to inhibit. Specifically, there's the CCK, secretin, and gastrin. Gastrin is the one that stimulates the gastric juices. CCK stimulates bile and pancreatic enzymes to break down all the food we eat. And then secretin stimulates bicarbonate, and then both of them inhibit what they started in order to stop peristalsis.
Nice, yeah. Yeah, so they have all sorts of these different loops of interactions with gastrin, CCK, and secretin. Yeah, there's a really good picture on the PowerPoint. I'm going to see if I can share with y'all. Let's see. Okay, can y'all see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if this...
The gastric.
Oh, no, not that one. Oh, thank you, Dr. Fernandez. We're gonna, I forgot the volume automatically comes on. Where is?
A little further.
A little further down.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Okay, yes, this slide is gold. So you can
Each step in the digestion.
Yeah.
Let's
I love this.
pause the. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez, for the extra vocals, but no thank you. Yes, so this picture or this whole slide is really helpful for seeing everything that's going on. So when you have food coming in, that stretching of the stomach is releasing the gastrin, which is going to go back to the stomach to cause it to release gastric juices. So it's kind of this own little loop here. Whereas other enzymes you can see work together where secretin is going to act on the pancreas to dump in more enzymes. CCK2 can cause a contraction with the bile. One other group we were also talking about this while we're on this subject. So the liver is what produces the bile, but then it puts most, if not all of it, into the gallbladder for storage. So then when digestion occurs, you just have contraction of the gallbladder and that squirts the bile into the duodenum. But if you get your gallbladder removed, you can do that surgically, or if you just aren't, some people just aren't born with one, or they're born with a really reduced one, then your liver just kind of lets bile trickle into there on its own. And so you just have to eat less fatty food because you'll have less bile available to emulsify all of it. Emulsify is just a fancy word of the bile doing its thing where it breaks the fat globules into little droplets. But yes, I would definitely go back and just kind of look at this later. Make sure to make a chart. It's really easy. Let's see, how do we hop out of this? Oh, no, thank you, Dr. Fernandez. There we go. How do we stop share? There we go. Okay. Make sure to know where each of those hormones are coming from, what each of them caused to happen, and if they have like any sort of other effects. There's a couple of charts online that y'all can look for. You can also just sort of make your own, but these make really easy questions to check if you understand it or not. So therefore it's extra good things. That's an extra good thing to memorize. So, all right, jumping on to 15. In what forms and locations can energy from digestion be stored? Who would like to answer 15? Maddie, do you have 15?
So in the liver and muscle cells, it's stored as glycogen.
Nice.
And then in adipose cells, which are fat cells, there's liver glycogen and then muscle glycogen and fat.
Yes, so you're going to store, first when sugar comes in and we start absorbing it, we're going to store it in the liver as glycogen first, and then after that you'll store it in your muscles as glycogen. So you actually have sugar stored in your muscles. That way, when you do, especially anaerobic things, you have a bunch of sugar already available to burn through. And that's also why sometimes like you can sprint really quickly and you have all that glycogen there to burn through, but then after a while you start getting pretty tired because you have to start getting it from the blood. And then finally, if you have extra energy, you'll dump it in the adipose cells, which are basically just fat cells, which we talked about last time, that has cushioning effects, energy storage, all of that. And then so that order of you deposit energy in the liver, the muscles, and then the adipose cells, that's the same order too that you draw out energy. So if your blood sugar is low, you're first going to look to the liver, and then you're going to look to the muscles. And then once you start running out of sugar from those, then you're going to start burning your fat and converting that into carbohydrates and sugars that can be used. So neat. Thank you, Maddie. Number 16, explain glucose homeostasis with all the hormones involved, starting with the consumption of food. The extra fun one. Okay, cool.
So basically how it works is if there's like a good figure in the textbook, figure 41.21 on page 914, it gives a good idea of what it does. So what happens is there's like two situations that could happen. It could either be your blood glucose level rises or your blood glucose level falls. So if it rises above the normal level, then beta cells of the pancreas secrete insulin, and insulin then increases or enhances the transport of blood glucose to body cells and stimulates the liver to store glucose as glycogen, and then your blood glucose level goes back down to its normal state, and so now you're back in homeostasis. And so then if it falls, alpha cells of the pancreas secrete glucagon into the blood, which promotes the breakdown of glycogen in the liver and the release of glucose into the blood. And so that glucose is released back into the blood. Your blood glucose rises back to normal.
Awesome. Yeah, really well said, Will. Thank you. And this is another one too, where there's, especially with this, there's a lot of things that sound kind of the same, but they do very different things. So let's just kind of, this for everyone, we'll go over this together. What is the storage form of sugar? Glycogen, yeah. Glycogen is how you're going to store it. And it's stored in this special branched way. It's very branched, and so that makes it really easy to break off a bunch of sugars quickly. If you think way back from last semester, we talked about how there are just different ways you can have branch storage and non-branch storage. The branch is nice because you can access it really quickly. Sweet. So yeah, glycogen is the storage form. What kind of sugar do you find just floating around in the blood? Glucose. Awesome. And then what hormone is going to increase blood sugar? Glucagon. And then what hormone is going to decrease your blood sugar? Insulin. Which of those hormones is going to cause sugar to go into the cells?
Glucagon. No, insulin.
Insulin, yeah. Insulin allows sugar to go into the cells, and therefore sugar leaves the bloodstream, lowering your blood sugar, but increases the number of sugars in your cells. Whereas glucagon is telling the liver to dump a bunch of sugar from the liver into your bloodstream, which is going to increase your blood sugar. And then you don't want to have too high or too low. If you have too low of a blood sugar, you can have seizures. So if y'all know any type 1 diabetics, they often have like a candy bar or something with them, because if their sugar starts to get really, really low, you run the risk of having a seizure. The opposite of that is if it gets really, really high, you can go into diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a fancy way of saying you can't get any of that sugar into your cells because you don't have enough insulin or the insulin's not working. So your body starts burning through fats because that's the only source of energy it can use. But then going through all those fats releases a lot of acid, which is super harmful and can also cause damage to your brain, your kidneys, your heart, and all sorts of other things. So it's really important that And it's really awesome that our body normally does regulate all of our blood sugar just fine. Which kind of cells make glucagon?
Alpha,
Alpha cells. And which kind of cells make insulin?
beta,
And where do you find alpha and beta cells?
Pancreas.
pancreas.
Yeah, in this little section called the islet or the inlet. It's like islet, the islet, something like that, of the pancreas. And then if you have type 1 diabetes, which of those cells dies?
Alpha.
Beta.
It's the beta. So in type 1 diabetes, it's like an autoimmune disease where your body attacks the beta cells and therefore your body stops producing insulin entirely. And so that's why type 1 diabetics have to have a pump or some sort of form of insulin with them to inject every couple of hours or after they eat, because they don't produce any. Whereas if you have type 2 diabetes, usually the issue is that your cells aren't responding to the insulin. So you could either take more insulin, think of like the Le Chatelier's. If you just shove more insulin in there, eventually it'll allow the sugar to get into the cells. Or you can take medications that allow your cells to be more sensitive to the insulin. But those are issues for HPhys. So we'll just keep moving from there. But thank you for the explanation, Will. Okay. We kind of just talked on this, but I talked about this. But would anyone like to just kind of re-explain 17? Why does diabetes mellitus cause a person to rely on energy from fats? Jordan, would you like to take this one?
Okay. Isn't it because their cells like don't respond to insulin anymore, or they don't? Yeah, like they're just not sensitive to it, or they like have a deficiency in it, and so they can't get energy from like glucose, like not enough to make their metabolic systems function. So they have to figure out a different source of energy. So usually they use like fat cells or adipose cells.
Exactly, yeah. They end up burning all the fats inside their cells, so they have to absorb more fats to get their energy. And then since all the fat's getting absorbed out of the blood, you have to burn your fat in your adipose cells, or push the fat from your adipose cells into your bloodstream. And so that's also why rapid weight loss can be a sign of diabetes too. And usually you just urinate out all that extra sugar, which is why it can be so damaging to your kidneys, because the sugar can't go into your cells, so your body just keeps throwing it into your urine. So diabetics usually at the start of it, they have to drink a lot of water because they're just urinating out all sorts of sugar that their body just can't use. So thanks, Jordan. I think that's all for the worksheet. I guess that's all for tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to stay around. I can answer some of your questions for a few minutes and we can talk through things. If not, happy studies. Happy, I guess, Dia. I guess today's Dia.
Doesn't feel like it.
Yeah. There's no,
your last dia. That's so sad.
no, I never got to do goat yoga. They normally have a thing where they bring like little baby goats and they do yoga and stuff.
Yeah.
That's okay. I'll come back sometime for that. Anyway, happy Dia. Feel free to hang around if you have questions. If not, have a good night.
Thanks, Liam.
Thank you, Liam.
Bye.